The floodwaters had risen quickly, turning the once peaceful riverbank into a turbulent expanse of churned earth and debris. As the currents carried the murky water past the scattered trees, a soft, strained bark barely pierced the roar of the flood. It was weak, distant, but there. For a moment it was hard to tell whether it was real, or if the wind had carried a sound that shouldn't have been there. But then it came again. A bark, quieter this time, but unmistakable. On the far side of the river, clinging to a half-submerged branch, a dog struggled to keep its head above water. Its fur, matted and sodden, hung in wet strands around its emaciated frame. Each wave that crashed against the tree seemed to push him further from safety. He was shivering, but not from the cold. His body was shaking with a raw exhaustion, a trembling born from fear and the overwhelming fight to survive. The flood had claimed everything in its path, and now the dog was caught in the midst of it. The animal's eyes flickered with something too soft to call hope, but too strong to call surrender. His gaze, though clouded with fatigue, seemed to reach out, his body shifting slightly, every movement slow, deliberate, like a plea for help in the desperate moments between breaths. The water was rising steadily, creeping toward the small branches that held him. He moaned, a soft, pitiful sound that was swallowed by the rush of the current. There were no other animals in sight. No voices of distress rising from the flood. This dog, alone in his fight, seemed to have nowhere to turn. He looked back at the waters behind him, seeing only the unyielding flow that held him captive. He had no strength left to pull himself to safety and no choice but to hold on. The man who found him didn't waste time in making decisions. There were no frantic shouts, no quick rush forward. His movements were quiet, careful as he waded into the river. He had seen enough floods to know that panic could be as dangerous as the water itself. The dog had seen him long before he stepped into the current, and its gaze turned toward him, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or simply the instinctive desire to survive. "Stay still, boy," the man whispered softly, his voice low, almost lost in the noise of the flood. His tone wasn't harsh, but gentle, calming, meant only to reassure the animal that help had arrived. The dog didn't flinch, but the brief pause in its trembling body suggested that, for a fleeting moment, it might have believed him. The man reached him slowly, the water rushing up his legs and tugging at his boots. When he finally reached the dog, he knelt down beside him, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle him. He reached out, fingers brushing against the wet fur, and the dog's body stiffened, every muscle taut with uncertainty. But there was no fight in him, no desperate struggle. He was too far gone for that. The man's hands worked gently, his fingers careful as they slid under the dog's chest and around his torso, lifting him with a quiet strength that seemed to ease the dog's burden. There was no struggle, only the soft rustle of fur against the man's arms as he pulled him toward the safety of the riverbank. As he was lifted from the water, the dog let out a soft whine, his body giving in to the release of the moment. His head fell against the man's shoulder as he was carried to higher ground, and for a moment the world seemed to quiet around them, the only sound the steady rush of the water below. It was only when the dog was safely on the bank, the current no longer threatening him, that the man allowed himself a moment to breathe. He could feel the weight of the dog's trembling body in his arms, could hear the labored breaths as the animal slowly began to settle. But there was still a long road ahead. This was only the beginning. The water was colder than the man expected, the current stronger as it tugged at his legs with every step. He didn't hesitate, though, moving forward with calm persistence. The dog was still clinging to the branch, but now his body barely stirred. The man could see the weariness in every line of the dog's form, his legs shaking violently, his sides heaving with shallow breaths. The water had drained him, leaving him weak and vulnerable. Each soft whine from the dog carried the weight of exhaustion, a quiet plea for something more than this endless struggle. The man reached the dog slowly, keeping his movements gentle, not wanting to startle him further. His hands, strong and steady, moved carefully toward the trembling animal. The dog didn't flinch, didn't pull away. His body, once full of frantic energy, seemed to have surrendered to the flood. There was no fight in him now, only the slow, rhythmic shaking of his body, as if he had no strength left for anything else. When the man's hands touched the dog's soaked fur, the animal's body stiffened for a moment, but there was no resistance. The dog's eyes met his, wide and filled with the emptiness of survival. There was a softness in the animal's gaze, a silent trust that came only in the moments where there was no other choice. The man could feel the dog's fear, but it was tempered by an exhaustion so deep that even the water seemed to have worn away the last of his strength. "It's okay, boy," the man whispered, his voice low and steady, meant to reassure, to calm. The dog didn't respond, but the slight relaxation in his body suggested the words, though faint, had touched him in some way. With slow, deliberate movements, the man slid his arms around the dog, gently lifting him from the branch. The dog's body was limp in his arms, the weight of it more than just physical. It felt like the weight of a lifetime of struggles, a fight against forces too large to control. As the man held him, his hands moved carefully, keeping the dog close but never squeezing too tightly. There was a tenderness in the touch, a quiet understanding that this was not a moment for urgency, but for compassion. The dog, still shaking, didn't struggle. He remained still, letting the man guide him through the water, inch by inch. The current pushed against them, but the man's focus never wavered. His eyes were fixed ahead, watching the space between him and the bank, the place where the land would rise again, where safety waited. He moved steadily, never rushing, never faltering. The water tugged harder, but the dog, now nestled securely in his arms, didn't resist. The flood, once overwhelming, now felt like something distant. The dog's trembling body softened ever so slightly as the distance to dry ground shortened. The man's arms were beginning to ache, but he didn't think about it. All that mattered was getting this animal to safety. There was no fear in his movements, only a quiet resolve, the unspoken knowledge that this was what needed to be done, and nothing else mattered in this moment. The man finally reached the shore, his feet dragging through the last of the water before stepping onto solid ground. He shifted the dog gently, laying him down on the wet earth. For a moment he paused, looking down at the dog's fragile form. The dog remained still, his breath still shallow, his body still shivering. But there was a calmness now, a stillness in the way the dog's body rested against the ground. His eyes closed briefly, the exhaustion finally overcoming him. The man crouched beside him, not moving, just watching the dog. The flood was still all around them, the sounds of it relentless, but here, on the bank, there was a quiet between them, a silence that spoke more than words ever could. The dog's body trembled less now, the shaking softening into the gentle rise and fall of sleep. The man remained beside him, watching over him, as if offering whatever peace he could until the world around them calmed once more. The man crouched beside the dog, his breath visible in the cool air, mixing with the last remnants of mist rising from the flood. He had carried the animal away from the water, every step measured, slow, and deliberate, his hands never once tightening their hold. Now, on solid ground, he moved carefully, placing the dog gently onto a dry patch of earth. The dog's body, still trembling from the cold, felt light in his arms, as though the weight of fear had worn it down, leaving only exhaustion in its place. He didn't rush, not now. His movements were soft, almost tender, as he draped his jacket over the dog's trembling form. The fabric, warm and heavy, settled over the dog's body, the heat gradually seeping through to soothe his chilled skin. The dog barely responded at first, lying there, eyes half closed, his body too spent to even twitch. He could not stand, nor could he lift his head. He lay there, limp, as though his body had simply forgotten how to carry itself, his sides heaving with the effort to breathe, though slower now. The man sat back on his heels, his gaze soft and steady, watching the dog's every movement, every shallow breath. The dog's eyes flickered for a moment as if something within him stirred. They weren't the frantic, wide eyes of someone trapped in terror, but something quieter, more still, like the first sign of trust in a place that felt unfamiliar. Slowly, the trembling began to ease, the dog's body responding to the warmth that the jacket provided. He let out a low, soft sigh, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, though his body remained still. The man didn't speak, only observed. He knew better than to rush this moment. The flood was still a distance away, its roar muted but constant, but here, on the higher ground, the dog had no more need to fight the water. His body relaxed ever so slightly, and the man could see the exhaustion, the confusion that had plagued him begin to settle. There was no immediate movement to get up, no frantic lurching toward a safety. It was as though, for now, all the dog could do was breathe, to simply exist in the quiet between moments of struggle. The man's eyes followed the dog's slow recovery, noting the soft way the dog shifted his legs, stretching them out, one slow movement at a time. It was as if he was testing the limits of his own body, unsure whether he had the strength to stand again. The man's gaze softened even further, watching as the dog's body language subtly changed. The tension in his shoulders, the slight curl of his tail, the tightness in his face, these things all began to loosen, to let go. His breath was steady now, deeper than before. It was still too soon to call it complete relief, but it was a start. For a long while, neither of them moved. The man sat quietly beside the dog, letting the moment settle around them, the warmth between them growing. The dog, though drained, no longer seemed wholly lost to the flood. His gaze, though still distant, had softened, no longer filled with the wide, fearful eyes of a creature trapped. There was a trust there now, not in words, but in the stillness that surrounded them. The man reached out, gently placing a hand near the dog's head, the tips of his fingers brushing against the fur. The dog didn't flinch, only gave the briefest glance toward his hand, his gaze softening even more. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The man let his hand linger there for a moment before slowly pulling it back. He didn't need to do more. The dog wasn't yet ready to rise, but he wasn't completely lost either. As the minutes stretched on, the dog's trembling gradually stopped, the warmth of the jacket pulling him further from the cold grasp of the flood. The world around them, still roiling with the flood's aftermath, began to settle in the quiet that surrounded them. The man remained still, observing, knowing that no further actions were needed. Time would do the rest. The dog, now quieter, softer, was safe, for now, and that was all the man needed to know. The winds shifted, bringing with them the scent of wet earth and the distant sound of the water moving downstream. The air, though cold, no longer felt threatening. In this small, quiet space, there was no rush, no urgency, only the slow return of warmth, both physical and emotional. The man sat beside the dog, waiting, knowing that when the time came, the dog would rise again. For now, they were safe, and that was enough. The dog had settled for a while on the higher ground, his breath finally even, his body still, wrapped in the warmth of the jacket. The air around him had calmed, and the earth beneath him was a quiet contrast to the chaotic waters he had just escaped. The man watched him closely, the relief that had come with safety settling in his chest. For a moment, everything felt still, as if the world, too, had paused to take a breath. But then, just as it seemed the danger had passed, the dog stirred. He shifted on the ground, a slight movement at first, then more deliberately. The man, who had been waiting for the dog to fully relax, suddenly found himself watching the animal carefully again. The dog's eyes had lifted, focused on something beyond him, beyond the calm of the bank. He rose to his feet with a subtle strength, his body still shaky but determined. Without a sound, he moved toward the river's edge, his steps slow and cautious, as if he knew something the man did not. The man remained where he was, watching as the dog's movements grew more purposeful. The floodwaters had receded from this part of the land, but the edges of the river were still jagged with debris. The dog didn't hesitate. He moved through the soft mud, his legs unsteady but carrying him forward with quiet resolve. The man stood, his own curiosity pulling him closer. At the water's edge, the dog paused, his body still for a moment as he gazed into the current. There was no fear in his stance, no panic. He didn't bark, nor did he make any sound. The man, now a few steps behind, felt the weight of the silence between them. It wasn't until the dog moved again that the man understood. From the reeds by the river, the dog emerged, not alone, but with two small forms trailing behind him. They were drenched, their fur soaked through, their tiny bodies fragile against the lingering threat of the flood. The man's breath caught in his chest, not from fear, but from the sudden realization of what had just happened. The dog had found them, his puppies. They were so small, their legs shaky as they followed their mother's lead, their bodies trembling in the cold air. The man knelt slowly, instinctively, watching the dog guide the pups to safety. The dog didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He stayed ahead, leading them with a quiet certainty, his own body more grounded now as he walked beside them. The puppies, though exhausted, seemed to understand what had to be done. They moved with their mother, each step shaky but steady, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The man's eyes followed the three of them, his heart heavy with the weight of it. The puppies were still too small, too weak to make it on their own, and yet here they were, alive. The dog, despite his own exhaustion, had never given up on them. He had somehow found the strength to lead them out of the flood, to bring them back to safety. When they finally reached the dry ground where the man stood, the dog and the two pups lay down in the soft earth, their bodies still trembling, but no longer from fear. The man approached them slowly, his movements careful, not wanting to intrude on the quiet trust between them. The dog, though weak, didn't growl or pull away. He simply watched the man, his eyes soft, the faintest flicker of gratitude in their depths. The man knelt beside them, just out of reach, not wanting to crowd them, but feeling the need to ensure their safety. He glanced at the pups, their tiny bodies pressed against their mother for warmth. One of them, the smaller of the two, let out a soft whimper, a sound so faint it could almost be missed. The dog's head turned, and for the briefest moment, his eyes softened even more, as the light began to dim. Casting long shadows over the land, the man remained where he was, watching the family. The quiet between them was more than just the absence of sound. It was a quiet understanding, a shared moment of survival. The dog, though still weak, had not given up on his family, and now, as they rested together, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of earth and wet grass. The river, though no longer a threat, continued to flow in the distance, its steady rhythm a reminder of the forces of nature that could change everything in an instant. But here, on this small patch of land, there was peace, soft, quiet, earned. The dog, his puppies, and the man, each part of the quiet landscape, shared this moment without words, but with the understanding that sometimes survival was a gift given, not taken. The family rested, and the world moved on around them, a little more still than before. The dog had settled into a fragile stillness on the bank, his breathing now more steady than it had been since the flood had first claimed him. The trembling of his body, which had once been a constant, had slowed, the deep shudders that rattled his frame less frequent, though his body remained thin and frail. His eyes, though still distant and heavy with exhaustion, had softened. The quick, panicked glance he had given the man when he first arrived had been replaced by something gentler, though it was a trust born from an understanding of survival, not affection. The man remained nearby, not crowding the dog but watching over him with careful eyes, observing every movement, every flicker of the dog's expression. The exhaustion of the flood, the terror of his struggle, had all left their marks. But now there was quiet. The dog no longer fought the water, no longer felt the panic of being swept away. He was still, the weight of the floodwater replaced with a soft weight of exhaustion. And yet, despite all that had passed, the dog had not yet fully relaxed. He lay there, vulnerable in his stillness, as though unsure if the moment of calm would last. The man's hands were steady, his fingers barely brushing against the animal's fur, his touch never pressing but always present. There was nothing urgent in his movements, nothing that would startle the animal further. There was no rush. It was a quiet time, one of slow healing. The air between them was still, the waters in the distance receding with a soft roar that now seemed far away, no longer a threat. The dog's eyes flickered briefly before closing once more. He was breathing deeply now, the rise and fall of his chest steadying, though his body still carried the quiet tension of someone who had known too much pain. The mother, who had been caught in the flood, was not just recovering physically. There were other things she had to process, small, quiet thoughts that drifted through her like the remnants of the storm itself. And so they both lay in this peaceful quiet, the man not rushing the dog's recovery. It was in that stillness, in that careful space, that the first movement came. The dog, though still weak, shifted his head slightly. It was almost imperceptible at first, an inch of motion that seemed to go unnoticed, even by the man, who was so attuned to the animal's movements. But then it came again. The dog stirred once more, his legs shifting beneath him, his body gradually beginning to lift, inch by inch. The man's heart quickened, unsure at first what this meant. The dog's movement wasn't frantic. It wasn't the sudden, wild struggle of an animal desperate to escape. It was slow, deliberate, as though the animal knew what he was doing, but was uncertain whether he could do it. The dog's body swayed as he pulled himself to his feet, his legs trembling under the effort. For a moment he seemed to hesitate. His gaze moved toward the edge of the river, his body shifting, and then back toward the man, still watching from a distance. Without a sound, the dog turned and began to move toward the river's edge. The man watched, holding his breath for a moment. He didn't know what the dog was doing. There was no immediate danger, but the movement felt unfamiliar. There was a quiet uncertainty in the way the dog approached the water, as though something deep inside him was still tied to the flood. The man stood slowly, ready to step forward if needed, but something in his gut told him to wait. There was no panic in the dog's steps. There was no wild desperation. The dog moved slowly, cautiously, as if testing his own limits, as if he had found the strength to act on his own terms. The dog paused at the edge of the river, his gaze fixed on the murky waters, still swirling with the aftermath of the flood. His body was tense again, his muscles coiled as if preparing to face something unseen. The man stood a few feet behind, watching carefully. The dog remained where he was for a long moment, head lowered slightly, his body unmoving except for the faintest shiver that passed through him. It was unclear whether he was searching for something in the water or simply taking the time to breathe, to be present in the quiet after the storm. And then, without warning, the dog turned and moved back, away from the river, as if the moment of uncertainty had passed. The man breathed a quiet sigh of relief, though it was unclear whether the dog had truly come to a decision, or whether he had simply realized that the task at hand was too much for him in that moment. But then, as if in response to the shift in the air, something else happened. The dog didn't lie down. He didn't retreat into his own body to rest. Instead, he moved once more, but this time, it was not just a return to the bank. As he turned back toward the river, his steps slowed, and he paused once again, his ears flicking backward. There was something in his movements, something that seemed more purposeful now. The man watched, not moving, barely breathing, as the dog moved once more toward the reeds that lined the water's edge. What followed was almost imperceptible at first, a barely noticeable movement that could have been missed by any casual observer. But the dog's head turned toward the water again, and this time there was a slow pull in his movements. His body shifted, and he began to move deeper into the reeds, his movements quiet but determined. For a moment, the man wasn't sure whether to follow, but as he stood there, still and waiting, he saw the first glimpse of what the dog had been seeking. There, half hidden in the reeds, two small shapes appeared. Two tiny, drenched puppies, no more than a few weeks old, emerged cautiously from the thicket of waterlogged grass. The man's heart skipped as he saw the faint stirrings of life in the small forms, their bodies weak and trembling. The dog, now more composed than he had been just moments ago, moved slowly but purposefully toward them. His body was still weak, but there was something steady in the way he guided them forward. The puppies, though weak from the cold, stumbled after their mother, their tiny paws slipping in the soft earth as they tried to keep up with her slow, determined pace. The mother dog turned back, her eyes soft but full of purpose, making sure that the puppies were following. The man stood still, his breath coming in shallow, steady breaths as he watched the scene unfold before him. There was no hurry. There was no panic. There was only the quiet rhythm of a family reunited in the face of all that had passed. The dog nudged the smaller of the two puppies forward, gently guiding them toward the dry ground. The second puppy, though smaller and weaker, followed closely behind. They stumbled but moved with determination, the bond between them palpable in every slow step. The dog did not rush them, did not push them forward with any force. He guided them with a gentle certainty, as though he knew the way, as though he knew that this was the only place that mattered right now. When they reached the safety of the bank, the mother dog curled her body around the puppies, sheltering them with her warmth. The puppies, exhausted and shivering, nestled close to her, seeking comfort in the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing. The mother remained still, her head turning occasionally to look at the man, who had remained a silent witness to this quiet moment of survival. The man took a step back, his heart filled with something too deep to name, too quiet to be captured in words. There, in the quiet shadows of the bank, was something simple, something pure, the quiet bond of a mother and her young, the slow return of life after a storm that had seemed too large to survive. For a long while, nothing moved. The man, his body still and his heart steady, simply watched. There was no need to intervene. There was no urgency left. The family, though small and fragile, had found their way. And though the flood had taken so much, it had also given something back in this simple, quiet moment. And as the man stood, taking a final glance at the small family before him, he stepped away quietly, knowing that, for now, the cycle of survival had turned. The floodwaters continued their steady rush in the distance, a constant muted roar that echoed faintly through the trees. But here, in this quiet corner of the bank, the storm seemed far away. The dog, still exhausted but steady, lay curled around her two small puppies, their bodies pressed close together, seeking the warmth of one another, their tiny forms barely moving but for the slow rise and fall of their chests. The mother's eyes remained half-lidded, her gaze soft and unfocused, as though the world around her had slowed into a slow, tender rhythm. The puppies, though still shivering, had found their rest, their little bodies relaxing under the protection of their mother's warmth. The man stood a few paces away, his eyes fixed on the small family. The tension in his chest, which had gripped him during the moments of uncertainty, had slowly released. There was no rush to leave, no immediate need for action. This moment, as quiet and still as it was, needed no intervention. The dog and her pups were safe now. The flood, though it still raged in the distance, could not touch them here. The mother, though weak and worn, had found her ground again. Her breathing was slower now, each exhale a little deeper. Her eyes, once filled with the sharpness of survival, had softened, the look of fear replaced with a quiet trust that had begun to grow between her and the man. He had not pushed her, had not hurried her. He had simply been present, calm, waiting. She had accepted his help, had let him guide her to safety. And now, here, she had settled. Her body no longer trembled with the cold. The quiet between them felt like a promise of something more, a return to peace, however fragile. The puppies, still finding their footing in the world, rested close to her, their tiny bodies curled into the warmth of their mother's fur. The man observed them for a moment longer, his heart swelling with the quiet, tender strength of this family that had survived. He could see the small movements of the puppies, their heads nestled under their mother's chest, their paws twitching in the sleep that had overtaken them. They were safe now, protected by the presence of their mother and the stillness of the land they had found. The man's gaze lingered on the family for a moment longer, his mind silent. His emotions caught between the quiet relief of this moment and the knowledge that the journey ahead for the small family was still uncertain. The river, though it had given them this small respite, was still powerful. And yet, for now, this was enough. They were here. They were safe. The future would unfold in its own time. The light, though fading, still held a warmth. The sky, tinged with the last hues of sunset, seemed to reflect the peace that had settled over this small family. The quiet of the moment deepened. The man, feeling the weight of the day, stepped back slowly. He had done all he could. His presence here, a quiet witness to this small miracle, was enough. He whispered softly, his voice a barely there murmur. "Good dog." It was not a declaration of praise, but a quiet acknowledgement of the dog's strength, of the bond they had shared in those moments of struggle. The dog didn't respond, but her body shifted slightly, a soft exhale of relief. The man, standing a few feet away, knew that there was nothing more to do. He turned away, moving slowly toward the quiet path that led back to the world beyond this small corner of peace. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of wet earth, the remnants of the flood. It was a soft, quiet breeze, and it seemed to carry the quiet promise of new beginnings. As the man walked, he didn't look back, but he could feel the pull of the small family behind him. Their fragile lives tucked away in the fading light of the evening. The flood still roared in the distance, but here, in this small corner of the world, life had been pulled from the water. And as the man stepped into the quiet of the evening, the image of the dog and her puppies nestled together stayed with him. There was no grand resolution, no dramatic change, just the soft, quiet rhythm of life moving forward. And that was enough. The last light of the day faded gently into the horizon, leaving only the soft, steady rise and fall of the family's breathing, a small, quiet world of peace amidst the lingering echo of the flood.